managed to complete that task. Key point to conclude is increasing your awareness of the ability to understand culture and subcultural differences to enhance the experience of youth sport is really important. So it's really worth investing time and understanding this. And it may arise that because you have an athlete that comes to your session or club or whatever it is that you're working in, then that kind of makes you start going away and getting some more information and understanding of this area. We're now going to look at gender in terms of youth sport. So what does gender refer to? Gender refers to the characteristics and behaviours and activities that society considers appropriate for females and males, typically labelled as feminine and masculine. So we've looked at gender. The other area that often gets confused between gender is sex. So sex is the difference between reported in terms of the biological characteristics based on a person's chromosomes, hormonal profiles, and internal and external reproductive organs. So sex is biological and fixed, whereas gender is culturally constructed and fluid. So an example for this could be there are more male than female footballers in the UK, and in the US is a gender difference. Whereas the average height of an adult male is greater than an average height of adult female is a sex difference. Well, you might be thinking, well, I obviously know the difference between these two things. The distinction is important because when certain differences are, mislabelled as sex differences, but are generally gender differences, we tend to assume that males and females are biologically differ and culturally construct characteristics based on this. So it's having an understanding of how gender and sex impacts on sport. So focusing on kind of one key area is the gender differences in terms of physical characteristics and motor skills. There are several different average gender differences apparent in physical characteristics and motor skills of males and females. These tend to start off as small differences and increase through childhood, particularly after adolescence. So this could be linked to regard to strength, speed, aerobic endurance. There are small differences between boys and girls before the age of 12, but this kind of then changes as males grow stronger and faster and more have greater endurance capabilities after sort of the age of 12, whereas females have more flexibility and better fine motor skills at all ages. So it's having an understanding of these biological differences. Gender differences also are apparent in fundamental skills. So females are better than males at hopping, skipping and leaping, whereas males are better than manipulative activities like throwing, catching and kicking. That's a bit of a sweeping statement, but this is by research done by Barnett, Morgan, Brooks and Beard 2010. Average differences or gender differences in sport and motor skills may be attributed to the physical and biological differences, as well as the differentiation of socialisation of boys and girls in our society. So what I mean by that is, yes, there's sex differences in terms of the biomechanics and biological changes which may impact motor skill development, but there's also societal and cultural differences that children are then imposed in different situations based on things that are in our society. So, are boys given more opportunities in that environment? Do girls prefer a different type of play environment? And all those things need to be considered. So based on this kind of key information around, the differences between gender, as a result of this, you have the terminology which is called gender stereotyping. So how girls and boys in our culture learn about our and internalise generalised beliefs and values and practices. So this is also called socialisation, a process which we actively formulate ideas about who we are and how we are supposed to act or not act. Males and females are socialised in very different ways in most cultures. As a result of socialisation, stereotypes are often formed. A stereotype is a popular belief about specific types of individuals or certain categories. So, focusing on gender stereotyping, it's a process by which children, biological and sex, determines the activities they engage in or not engage in, as well as the manner in which they are treated in these activities. Sports are generally considered as masculine domain, and thus stereotyping results in boys perceiving greater ability and attaching greater importance to sports than girls do. This contributes to gender difference observed in sport. So if we look at kind of gender stereotyping, in the last 100 years, there's obviously been a great change with more females and being involved in sport, but you will have seen, in the last 100 years, the kind of where, males, it was a male domain, and then it's gradually improved, but there's still gender stereotyping in perceived and that's based on cultural understanding of sport. So, example of that, the film musical Billy Elliot, from a very sort of male-dominated environment, where the story is, based on Billy, who, his dad is very masculine and sees dancing as not a sport or an activity his son should be doing. So that's, a prime example of gender stereotyping. Here are some further examples of this kind of gender stereotyping. So females maybe not being encouraged by parents to be physically active. Parents have been shown to provide less encouragement for physical activity, offer less or fewer sporting related opportunities for their daughters than for their sons, and perceive their sons to have higher sport competence than their daughters. This is by research by Fredericks and Eccles 2005. Females are less apt to be taught and engage in fundamental skill during kind of sensitive periods. When females fail to develop, that critical movement skills during their early years, they are disadvantaged, as they progress into sport participation. It may be the lack of opportunity, instruction, peer socialisation that blocks girls from this. It may be as a result of peer socialisation and derogatory marks from boys in terms of, girls aren't good at sport. It could be, key comments that you hear in the playground, girls are weak, they're girly girls, it's a man's game. All those types of terminology would be instrumental in this. Gender stereotypical toys that have been emphasised through childhood and adolescence. So, are there specific toys that boys should be playing with to convert girls, and does that relate to a sporting context? Youth sport are often pressured into gender appropriate sport. Thinking back to when I was a kid playing sport, I was the only girl in my team, in actually all the teams in the club. And then in the league that I played in the area, there was 2 girls. That was it. So if you look at that compared to now, there'll probably be a greater difference and there'll be a lot more girls playing. But girls, are pressurised into particular sports. And then I guess all my friends were playing netball and going to gymnastics club and brownies and guides and stuff. And I happily wanted to play football. I played with my brothers, played as a child, and then obviously then perceived on to play in that sport. So there's still pressures to go into gender appropriate sports. And this is based on kind of gender stereotyping in terms of, things that are perceived to be more or less appropriate. So gymnastics for girls because they're more flexible, football for boys because it's rough and it involves lots of contact. Female athletes are constantly sexualised by the media. Sexualisation occurs when people value a girl or woman primarily on their sexual appeal and view her as an object of sexual use. Sexualisation of girls begins at puberty, which is a big reason, which can affect their self-esteem and maybe why they drop out of sport at this stage. They view pictures of female athletes in sexual poses, and girls feel negative about their own physical appearance and the image, comparing them to a sporting idol or different kind of sporting role models, but also role models outside sport. So it's around how the media depict athletes and kind of have a counteractive impact on that child or that girl in terms of their engagement. And then we focus quite a lot on the girl side of things, but it's so important to focus on the boys as well. Boys who are not physically skilled or good athletes experience ridicule, embarrassment based on their rigid male stereotypes that include strength, masculinity, athleticism and lack of empathy for other participants. So boys who are good at sports are often popular among peers with enhanced self-esteem and self-image and have a positive identity. And then this often then results in ridiculing experiences by boys who don't fit into this culturally prescribed gender role and may cause them to struggle with their self-esteem and confidence and social relationships. So yes, there's lots of kind of, historical issues with girls in terms of gender stereotyping, but also, again, it still happens with boys as well. So as a coach, understanding, and as someone working in youth sport, understanding the differences between, boys and girls in terms of gender and the biological side of it in terms of sex, understanding the gender stereotypes that have been developed and what is gender stereotyping and actual examples of that. But then understanding from those examples how we can work to overcome some of those issues. How can we encourage boys who are maybe not physically and as good athletes and skill performers as some of the other boys? How can we engage and encourage them to stay in sport? And how can we kind of make some of those kind of gender-specific sports or perceived gender-specific sports more open to girls to take part in? Moving on from this, it's really important to start to understand, so we can impact on this, is why gender stereotyping occurs. Many parents explain their gender stereotyping parenting practices as coming from a desire for their children to fit in to accepted culture. So it's about changing that culture, and that's why we talked about that cultural competence, about changing people's views and opinions. Children and adolescents need to be educated about the harmful gender stereotypes that have been limited and destructive to both males and females in sport. So it's using things like derogatory terms, making sure this doesn't occur, and things like homophobia, racism, that kind of stuff. How parents engage in the toys and the activities they engage for their child, to reduce that kind of the differences. And the final kind of key point is around making sure we don't we get rid of those some key areas around the males holding that dominant position, whereas the females are subordinate positions in sport, and how we change that cultural and kind of that thought process around that. There's room for girls in sport, there's boys in sport and boys in sport and girls together, all kinds of sports, and our culture enriches it because of this. So it's really important to understand this when we're moving forward working with young performers. So moving on beyond these gender stereotypes, it's really important as coaches and leaders of sport is that we don't ignore kind of key comments and sexist comments such as "you throw like a girl," "boys will be boys," what other things, "bros before hoes," all those kind of statements which are unacceptable and damaging to everyone. So we have a responsibility working with children and youth to instill positive role models, eliminating kind of sexist comments and these gender stereotypes. And I think the following example of Monet Davis, who is a youth athlete who's actually appeared on the front cover of Sports Illustrated in the US, and the following kind of two little YouTube links actually talk about the story of Monet, who is battling these gender stereotypes as a result of her success playing sport, and obviously playing in a boys' environment as well.